So, Princess Anne has just done the unthinkable. She didn't call her brother, King Charles. She didn't warn Queen Camilla. Instead, she went straight to the lawyers. The target? Tom Parker Bowles, the Queen's own son, accused of turning the late Elizabeth II's most sacred sanctuary into a commercial playground for the global elite. As the legal machinery grinds into motion, one question haunts the palace. Why did the Princess Royal choose to strike in total silence? Before we uncover the hidden evidence that forced Anne's hand, take a moment to subscribe so you never miss the next royal investigation. Stories of this magnitude rarely stay behind closed doors for long, but to understand why the Princess Royal chose legal warfare over a family conversation, we have to look back to the exact moment the silence at Balmoral was broken. The atmosphere inside Clarence House was one of practiced rhythmic silence until the telephone rang on a crisp afternoon. It was not the private line reserved for the intimate whispers of siblings or the soft, casual inquiries of family members. Instead, it was the formal, heavy ring of the senior legal counsel to the sovereign. When King Charles III answered, he expected a briefing on pressing state matters, or perhaps a routine update regarding the administrative complexities of the duchy. He did not expect to hear that his own sister, the Princess Royal, had initiated a formal legal inquiry involving his most private estate. Even more shocking was the specific name attached to the filing: Tom Parker Bowles. This was the exact moment the internal architecture of the House of Windsor began to groan under the weight of an unprecedented institutional betrayal. Charles, now 76 years of age, and navigating the immense complexities of his reign, alongside a deeply personal and challenging health journey, found himself staring at a reality he had spent a lifetime trying to avoid. His sister had not called him. She had not requested a private audience at Highgrove or suggested a quiet walk through the gardens to voice her concerns. She had bypassed the king entirely, treating the monarch not as her brother or a confidant, but as an administrative obstacle to be circumvented. That single decision spoke louder than any public statement. It revealed a fracture in the royal foundation that no amount of palace diplomacy could easily repair. The legal filing was precise, cold, and devastatingly professional. It alleged that the sanctity of Balmoral Castle, the very ground where their mother, Queen Elizabeth II, had drawn her final breath, had been fundamentally breached. The accusation was startling: that Tom, the Queen's 50-year-old son, had utilized the estate's private infrastructure for unauthorized and elite commercial gain. For Charles, the shock was twofold and deeply cutting. First, there was the possibility that his stepson had exploited the crown's most intimate refuge. Second, there was the chilling realization that Anne believed the only way to seek genuine justice was to strike through the courts before her brother could ever have the chance to intervene or soften the blow. Those who understand Princess Anne know that her stillness is far more dangerous than any loud public outburst. She is a woman of immense discipline, a royal who has spent over 7 decades adhering to a rigid code of conduct that always places the institution above the individual. By choosing a legal filing over a family conversation, she sent a message that echoed through the corridors of the palace. She no longer trusted the king to protect the late queen's legacy from the ambitions of his own blended family. As the news filtered through to Queen Camilla, the quiet confusion at Clarence House turned into a sharp, crystalline fury. The queen consort had spent 20 years meticulously rebuilding her public image, moving from the shadows of historical scandal to the side of the sovereign. Now, her own son was at the very center of a legal storm ignited by the woman who sits closest to the king's heart. The air between the siblings had turned to ice. This was no longer a simple misunderstanding over a family dinner. It was a formal declaration of institutional war. None of them yet understood how this had really begun. To comprehend the true weight of the emotional shockwaves rippling through the palace, one must look far beyond the cold language of legal documents and toward the mist-shrouded peaks of the Scottish Highlands. Balmoral is not merely a collection of stones or a vast stretch of 53,000 acres. For the children of the late queen, it is a spiritual geography. It was the one place on earth where the relentless machinery of the monarchy was permitted to slow down, where Elizabeth II could breathe the mountain air away from the cameras and the crushing weight of the crown. On the 8th day of September, 2022, it was within those very walls that the Queen drew her final breath, with the Princess Royal standing as a silent, steadfast witness at her bedside. For Anne, that moment transformed the estate into something untouchable. It was no longer a vacation home. It was a sanctuary of memory. a private cathedral dedicated to a mother's legacy. When reports surfaced that this hallowed ground had allegedly been treated as a luxury asset for paying clients, the betrayal felt deeply personal. It was as if a stranger had been invited to walk through a family's most intimate grieving space for the sake of a commercial transaction. Anne, a woman who has spent more than 70 years adhering to a code of silent duty and iron-clad principle, could not view this as a minor oversight. To her, it was a desecration of the very peace she had vowed to protect. The emotional fallout for Queen Camilla was equally intense, though fueled by a different fire. As a mother, the sight of her son being targeted by a formal legal action initiated by her own sister-in-law was nothing short of a public and private humiliation. For 20 years, Camilla had navigated the treacherous waters of royal life, slowly earning her place at the side of the king through patience and quiet service. To see that hard-won stability threatened by an allegation against her eldest child was an agony she could not easily hide. Sources suggest her reaction was one of profound fury, not only at the substance of the claim, but at the surgical coldness with which Anne had delivered it. The mother's instinct to protect her own collided head-on with the Princess Royal's instinct to protect the institution. King Charles, meanwhile, found himself paralyzed in the most painful position of his long life. At 76 years of age, he is a man who treasures harmony. Yet he was now the bridge between two women he loves, who were suddenly engaged in a struggle for the soul of his estate. His sister represented the unyielding standard of his mother's reign, while his wife represented the modern family he had fought so hard to build. The tension between the blood royals and the step family had finally reached a breaking point, and the king felt every ounce of the fracture. Even Prince William, usually so careful in his public positioning, was said to be deeply affected by the gravity of the breach. For the future king, the protection of royal spaces is not just about the past, it is about the integrity of the future he will one day inherit. The emotional stakes had been raised to a level that no one in the family could ignore. The sanctuary had been violated, and the trust that held the blended family together was rapidly dissolving into the Highland mist. But none of them yet understood how this had really begun. The true origin of this legal firestorm does not lie in a boardroom or a formal palace briefing, but in the frost-covered hills of the Scottish Highlands during the late autumn of 2023. To understand the hidden trigger, one must envision the state of Balmoral at that precise moment. The monarchy was in the midst of a profound transitional period. Following the passing of the late Queen, the administrative oversight of the private 53,000-acre estate was in a state of flux. Long-standing protocols were being reviewed, seasoned staff members were entering retirement, and the security infrastructure was undergoing a period of adjustment as King Charles III began to settle into his new role as the private owner of the land. It was in this specific window of administrative vulnerability that a shadow began to fall over the Highland sanctuary. The trigger was not a dramatic whistleblower report or a leaked intelligence memo. Instead, it was a single quiet conversation on a Tuesday afternoon. Princess Anne, who has always preferred the rugged solitude of the estate to the gilded halls of London, was making one of her frequent, unannounced visits to the grounds she has known for more than 7 decades. While speaking with an estate worker who had served the royal family for over 20 years, a detail was mentioned that immediately caused the Princess Royal to go still. The worker, speaking with the casual honesty often found among those who have spent their lives on the estate, noted that there had been unusual activity on the private roads during periods when the king was known to be in residence at Clarence House. These were not the familiar, muddy vehicles of the estate maintenance crews or the discreet, armored transport of the Royal Protection Command. They were high-end, luxury SUVs, the kind of vehicles associated with the most elite levels of private hospitality. Even more troubling was the timing. These vehicles were moving through the most sensitive areas of the forest and toward the private locks at hours that did not align with any sanctioned estate activity. Anne did not immediately raise the alarm with her brother. She is a woman who values evidence over emotion, and she began what those close to her describe as a quiet, surgical inquiry. She requested the gate logs and spoke to members of the transitional security team who had been rotating through the estate. What she uncovered was a series of alarming gaps in the perimeter of royal privacy. During these specific windows, unauthorized visitors were allegedly being ushered onto the grounds. They were being granted access to views and pathways that had been strictly reserved for the sovereign and her intimate family circle for more than 100 years. As the inquiry deepened, the name of Tom Parker Bowles began to surface with unsettling frequency. It appeared that the security protocols had been bypassed not through force or deception, but through the immense power of familiarity. The gates had been opened because the individuals requesting entry were associated with the king's own stepson. Anne realized that the sanctity of her mother's final refuge was not being threatened by outsiders, but was allegedly being compromised from within the expanded royal circle. She saw a pattern of repeat access that suggested this was not a series of isolated mistakes, but a deliberate exploitation of a unique position. But as Anne dug deeper, she realized these weren't just curious tourists, they were paying clients. The turning point arrived not with a shout, but with the cold, hard reality of a financial trail. As Princess Anne continued her meticulous investigation into the unauthorized Highland visitors, she uncovered a truth that shifted the entire narrative from a series of social favors to a calculated commercial enterprise. The high-end vehicles she had tracked were not carrying distant acquaintances or friends of the family. They were carrying paying clients. According to sources familiar with the inquiry, a clandestine operation had allegedly been established to transform the most private corners of the Balmoral estate into a luxury commercial venue for a global elite who viewed the world as their personal playground. The product being offered was something that money was never supposed to be able to buy: absolute, unauthorized exclusivity. These elite international clients, for whom five-figure sums were merely an afterthought, were reportedly being granted ghost tours of the late Queen's most cherished lands. They were walking through the ancient woodlands of Ballabui, fishing in the private lochs where the late sovereign once found her only true peace, and standing in the very meadows where the royal family had grieved in total seclusion only 1 year prior. For these individuals, the appeal was not just the scenery, it was the intoxicating proximity to the most intimate secrets of the House of Windsor. What chilled the Princess Royal to her core was the organized nature of the activity. This was not a few individuals sneaking through a broken gate. It was an orchestrated service. The revelation suggested that Tom Parker Bowles had allegedly identified a lucrative gap in the market. By leveraging his unique status as the king's stepson, a man who possessed the keys to the kingdom but held no official rank, he was positioned to offer a level of access that no travel agency on earth could replicate. The fees involved were said to be staggering, reflecting the priceless nature of a sanctuary that had been strictly closed to the public for more than 170 years. To Anne, this was more than a breach of security, it was a desecration. She saw a man she had welcomed into her family circle allegedly treating her mother's final refuge as a business asset to be leveraged for profit. The late Queen had guarded the privacy of Balmoral with a fierce, lifelong devotion, viewing it as a sacred trust held for the future of the monarchy. To see that trust traded away to the highest bidder, while the earth on her mother's grave was still settling, was an insult that the Princess Royal could not ignore. The commercialization of the Highlands reframed everything. This was no longer a misunderstanding between relatives or a simple breach of etiquette. It was a professional exploitation of the Crown's most sensitive property. The evidence gathered was indisputable. There were logs, witness accounts from confused staff, and the quiet but firm confirmation of financial arrangements that had no place in the king's private accounts. As the full picture emerged, the air inside the palace grew heavy, with the realization that the institution had been compromised by one of its own. The revelation transformed Tom from a charming step-relative into a significant institutional liability. For Anne, the path forward became narrow and sharp. The betrayal was absolute, but Anne knew she couldn't go to Charles to fix it. The moment the legal filing landed on the desks of the king's senior advisors, the crisis shifted from a private family dispute into a full-scale constitutional confrontation. In the world of the British monarchy, there is a distinct and often brutal line between the family and the institution. While the family deals in emotions and apologies, the institution deals in precedents and protocols. By involving the court, the Princess Royal had effectively activated the machinery of the crown, forcing the king's private secretary and the royal legal council to treat the matter with the same gravity as a breach of national security. The monarchy, often referred to as the firm, was now acting as its own investigator, and its primary objective was the preservation of the crown's integrity at any cost. It was at this critical juncture that the shadow of Prince William began to loom large over the proceedings. The Prince of Wales, now 42 years of age, has spent the last several years quietly but firmly defining the boundaries of his own future reign. Sources suggest that William did not hesitate to align himself with his aunt. For the heir to the throne, the situation at Balmoral was not merely an insult to the past, but a dangerous precedent for the future. He viewed the alleged commercialization of royal property as a symptom of a much larger problem: the blurring of lines between those who are born to the bloodline and those who are welcomed through marriage. William had already demonstrated his willingness to draw these lines with surgical precision. Upon inheriting the Duchy of Cornwall following the death of his grandmother, one of his first acts was to quietly remove Annabel Elliot, the younger sister of Queen Camilla, from the royal payroll. For nearly 20 years, she had been paid to manage the interiors of the estate's properties under the direction of Charles. William's decision to end that arrangement was the first clear signal that the new era would be one of professional distance rather than family patronage. By standing with Anne in the Balmoral conflict, William was reinforcing this message. He was signaling that the Step family's proximity to power did not grant them a license to operate within the royal shadows. The alliance between the Princess Royal and the Prince of Wales created a formidable front of blood royals that the king found nearly impossible to ignore. For Charles, this was a deeply isolating moment. He found himself trapped between the loyalty he felt for his wife and the institutional demands being pressed upon him by his sister and his son. The legal review was no longer a suggestion. It was an active process that would scrutinize every gate log and every unauthorized visitor. The advisors and private secretaries, who served the crown rather than the individual, were now bound by duty to follow the evidence wherever it led. The monarchy was becoming a cold character in its own right, one that prioritized the sanctity of its sanctuaries over the personal feelings of its members. The struggle was no longer about a few luxury vehicles in the Highlands. It was about who truly held the power to define the rules of the house. Charles realized that his desire for a peaceful, inclusive family was being dismantled by the very people who would one day ensure his legacy survived. With the Prince of Wales and the Princess Royal standing together, the king was suddenly the one left in the cold. The transformation of the Balmoral estate did not arrive with a fanfare or a public announcement. It manifested in the sudden, rhythmic clicking of locks and the rewriting of centuries-old rotas. Within days of the Princess Royal's legal filing, the administrative reality of the 53,000-acre sanctuary underwent a surgical overhaul. The most visible change was the immediate and total cessation of the luxury vehicle sightings that had sparked the initial inquiry. The private roads, which had allegedly served as the backdrop for clandestine tours, were now patrolled by a new tier of security personnel whose loyalty was not to the casual traditions of the past, but to the rigid protocols of the present. Behind the scenes, the restructuring was even more profound. King Charles III, acting under the immense institutional pressure of his sister and his heir, authorized a quiet but total reorganization of the oversight groups responsible for his private estates. These were not merely administrative shuffles, they were decisive political maneuvers. The figures who had managed Balmoral during the transitional window following the late Queen's death were reassigned to distant posts or encouraged into early retirement. In their place came a new wave of advisors, men and women whose careers were tied directly to the office of the Prince of Wales. William's influence was no longer a shadow. It was a visible and powerful presence in the very ledger books of the monarchy. For Tom Parker Bowles, the consequences were both absolute and professionally deniable. There was no dramatic eviction, but rather a slow, steady evaporation of the extraordinary access he had enjoyed for nearly 2 decades. His name began to disappear from the guest lists of crown events where his presence had once been an assumed courtesy. Scheduled appearances at royal residences were quietly canceled, citing administrative restructuring or security reviews. The currency of royal life proximity was being systematically withdrawn. The message was clear. The gates that had once opened to the sound of a familiar name were now firmly bolted against anyone who did not carry the weight of an official title or a blood connection. The palace was now engaged in what insiders described as a civil war by paperwork. Every invitation, every payroll adjustment, and every updated security brief served as a volley in a conflict that was invisible to the public eye, but devastatingly effective within the palace walls. The oversight of the private estates was now a fortress, guarded by individuals who reported to the future king rather than the current sovereign. This shifting of the guard represented a fundamental change in the balance of power. It signaled that the era of the blended family's unmonitored influence was coming to a swift and permanent end. Each visible change added to the emotional weight pressing down on the king and the queen consort. The office of the Princess Royal remained silent, her victory etched into the new security rotas and the empty passenger seats of the estate's vehicles. The monarchy was hardening its exterior, protecting itself from the perceived vulnerabilities of the Parker Bowles circle. The institution was moving with a cold, unstoppable momentum, erasing the gray zones that had allowed the breach to occur. But while the staff were changing the locks and rewriting the schedules, a much more painful and explosive confrontation was gathering strength behind the closed doors of Clarence House. The private apartments of Clarence House, once the hard-won refuge for a couple who had endured decades of public scrutiny, had become a theater of profound psychological exhaustion. King Charles III, now 76 years of age, found himself caught in a position of agonizing duality that threatened to undo the stability of his household. To his left stood his sister, the Princess Royal, wielding the cold, professional steel of the law to protect their mother's memory. To his right was his wife, the Queen Consort, whose maternal fury was fueled by 20 years of insecurity and the sudden public humiliation of her eldest son, Tom. Camilla's reaction to the legal filing was far from the quiet, stoic acceptance expected of a queen. Sources close to the private household suggest that her conversations with the king were nothing short of explosive. For Camilla, this was not merely a matter of estate management or unauthorized gate logs. It was a targeted, surgical strike. She perceived Anne's decision to bypass the king as a deliberate act of institutional cruelty, designed to remind the world that while she might sit upon the throne, her family would always remain outsiders. In her view, the legal action was a public declaration that the Parker Bowles children were a liability to be managed rather than family members to be embraced. This was a devastating blow to a woman who had spent 2 decades meticulously rebuilding her life since her marriage to the king in April of 2005. Charles, meanwhile, was a man paralyzed by his own heart. His ongoing health journey, defined by the immense personal trials he has faced throughout the last 12 months, has left him with a dangerously thin reserve of emotional energy. He had always been the bridge, the one who sought to weave his high families into a single harmonious tapestry. He had treated Tom as a son, welcoming him into the most private circles of royal life. Now, he was being forced to confront the reality that his own sister viewed that very kindness as a weakness that had allowed a sacred sanctuary to be compromised. The most painful realization for the king was the emergence of a new and haunting presence within the marriage. For decades, the shadow between Charles and Camilla had been the memory of the late Princess of Wales. But in this new era, the third person in their union was the ghost of Queen Elizabeth II. Princess Anne had transformed herself into the vessel for that ghost, acting as the uncompromising guardian of a legacy that she believed Charles was too soft to protect. By using the law instead of a conversation, Anne was telling her brother that his love for Camilla had blinded him to his duty to the crown. Camilla reportedly demanded that the king intervene, urging him to use his sovereign authority to pull Anne back and resolve the matter through the quiet, internal diplomacy that has long governed royal disputes. Yet Charles found himself powerless. With Prince William standing in total, silent alignment with his aunt, the king realized that the power had shifted. He was a monarch who could command the attention of the world, yet he could not mediate a conflict at his own dinner table. The trust that had sustained the royal couple was being eroded by the very institution they served. Camilla's fury was peak, but the public was about to see the first cracks in the royal facade. The moment the first whispers of the legal confrontation reached the fleet of royal commentators and the front pages of the broadsheets, the story ceased to be a private palace struggle and became a national debate. It began as a series of cryptic reports concerning an internal security review at Balmoral, but it quickly escalated into a full-scale public explosion. The headlines were unforgiving, often contrasting the disciplined, iron-willed Princess Royal against the perceived luxury of Tom Parker Bowles. For a public that has long admired Princess Anne for her stoicism and her status as the most industrious member of the royal family, the idea that she had been forced to take legal action to protect her mother's sanctuary resonated with a deep, ancestral sense of justice. The media landscape was suddenly saturated with experts and former palace officials, each offering their own interpretation of the fracture. On television screens and in the digital pages of major outlets, the conversation shifted to the fundamental nature of the modern monarchy. One dominant theme emerged: the protection of the bloodline versus the influence of the stepfamily. The British public, who had only recently seen the coronation of King Charles III and Queen Camilla, were now grappling with the reality that the harmony they had been promised was a fragile illusion. The contrast was stark. On one side stood the 73-year-old Princess Royal, a woman who has carried out hundreds of engagements every single year without a single complaint. On the other was a socialite food critic, whose primary claim to royal proximity was his mother's marriage. International reactions were equally intense. From the far corners of the Commonwealth to the newsrooms of New York, the question of Balmoral became a global fascination. The 53,000-acre estate was no longer just a Scottish castle. It was a symbol of the late Queen's soul. The allegation that it had been treated as a commercial asset for elite clients felt, to many, like a betrayal of the quiet, dignified service that Elizabeth II had personified for 7 decades. Social media platforms were alight with debate, with millions of voices weighing in on whether the Parker Bowles circle had overstepped their bounds. The consensus among a significant portion of the populace was clear. Royal spaces should be sacred, not for sale. The debate forced the palace to face a harsh reality. The public image of the monarchy was being redefined by this conflict. The slimmed-down monarchy that Charles had envisioned was now being viewed through the lens of internal litigation and familial suspicion. Commentators noted that this was the first major test of the king's authority since the beginning of his reign, and many observed that the power seemed to be slipping toward the Princess Royal and the Prince of Wales. The private decision of one woman to contact her lawyers had transformed into a sweeping national conversation about class, proximity, and the very future of the crown. The monarchy was once again a character in a drama it could not control. Every move, every statement, and every silence was being scrutinized by a world hungry for the truth. The debate was reaching a fever pitch, just as the family had to appear together in public. The first major public appearance following the legal filing took place under the watchful eyes of the global press, during a Sunday morning service that felt more like a diplomatic summit than a family gathering. As the royal motorcade arrived at the small stone church near the boundaries of the Balmoral estate, the world was looking for a single sign of reconciliation. Instead, they were met with a masterclass in silent exclusion. The visual symbolism replaced any need for dialogue, telling a story of institutional realignment that no palace spokesperson could ever hope to spin. Princess Anne was the first to emerge, her posture as straight and unyielding as a Highland pine. At 75 years of age, she carries herself with a terrifying clarity of purpose. There was no hesitation in her step as she moved toward the entrance, ignoring the frantic clicking of hundreds of cameras. Moments later, the king and queen consort arrived. In any other year, the family would have walked as a cohesive unit, a blended shield against the world. But on this morning, the distance between the Princess Royal and Queen Camilla was a vast, icy canyon. They did not exchange a single glance, a single nod, or even a polite acknowledgement of each other's presence. The silence was not merely quiet, it was deafening. The most telling detail, however, was the positioning of the Prince of Wales. Prince William, 42 years old and increasingly the architect of the monarchy's future, did not stand beside his father or his stepmother. Instead, he moved with a deliberate, calculated grace to stand at the side of his aunt. For the millions watching the live broadcast and the thousands standing along the roadside, the message required no translation. The heir to the throne was publicly and irrevocably aligning himself with the blood royals. He was validating Anne's legal crusade and signaling to the world that the protection of the late Queen's sanctuary was a shared mission. Inside the church, the seating arrangements further emphasized the internal fracture. The king sat between the two women he loved, a man visibly burdened by the weight of a conflict he could not resolve. His face, etched with the strain of a long and difficult year, told a story of a monarch who had lost control of his own domestic peace. Camilla, usually so adept at maintaining a warm, approachable public facade, appeared brittle. Her eyes remained fixed forward, never once straying toward the sister-in-law who had initiated the lawsuit against her son. The atmosphere was one of profound institutional discipline, where body language served as the ultimate judge and jury. The public understood. This was the visual manifestation of a banishment. The stepfamily dynamic had been shattered, and the Parker Bowles family had been pushed to the extreme periphery of the royal circle. The hierarchy had been restored with surgical coldness. By the time the service ended and the family departed, the narrative was set. The Princess Royal and the Prince of Wales had drawn a line in the Highland soil, and everyone else was standing on the other side. The monarchy was moving forward as a harder, more exclusive institution, leaving no room for the gray zones of the past. The message was sent to the world, but for Tom Parker Bowles, the final sentence was already written in private. The legal filings have been processed, the security rotas have been finalized, and the gates of the Highland Sanctuary have been locked once more. Yet, as the dust settles over the 53,000 acres of Balmoral, the institution that remains is fundamentally altered. What began as a quiet conversation on a Tuesday afternoon has resulted in the most significant internal realignment of the House of Windsor in more than 20 years. The firm has protected its soul, but the cost has been the total disintegration of the blended family harmony that King Charles III spent a lifetime trying to cultivate. For Tom Parker Bowles, the verdict is absolute. Sources suggest his access to private royal spaces is not merely restricted, it is effectively finished. The 2-year banishment from Crown territories, which many in the palace view as a minimum sentence, is likely to become a permanent exile in all practical terms. In the unforgiving world of the British monarchy, proximity is a gift that, once abused, is never granted a second time. Trust is not a legal concept that can be negotiated by counsel. It is the invisible glue that holds the palace together. And for the Queen's eldest son, that glue has dissolved entirely. Queen Camilla is left to watch her family's hard-won access to the inner circle quietly evaporate. She remains the Queen Consort, standing beside the King at state occasions and formal banquets, but the personal warmth that once extended to her children from the royal bloodline has turned to ice. She has learned a bitter lesson, that while she may wear the crown, she does not own the institution. The Princess Royal and the Prince of Wales have proven that the blood of the House of Windsor will always form a wall that even the most favored step relatives cannot scale. King Charles, now 76 years of age, moves through the final chapters of his reign with a visible and heavy exhaustion. He is a monarch who treasures the concept of a loving family, yet he has been forced to preside over its surgical fragmentation. He has had to accept that he could not protect his wife's son from the combined will of his sister and his heir. The power has shifted. The transition to the reign of the next generation has already begun in the shadows, characterized by a harder, cleaner, and less forgiving approach to those who exist in the gray zones of royal life. Princess Anne has achieved her objective. She has re-sanctified her mother's sanctuary and sent a message that will echo for decades. The private spaces of the sovereign are not commercial assets. She remains the most disciplined member of the family, a woman who has sacrificed personal comfort for the sake of an ancient principle. As the mist rolls over the peaks of Lochnagar and the silence returns to the forests of Balloch Bui, the late Queen's sanctuary is once again a place of untouched memory. The legal fight is over, the family fracture is permanent, and the fortress is secure. In the end, Princess Anne proved that while a king may rule the country, it is the daughter who guards the home.